Hey guys, okay, so in this video we're going to talk about the color schemes or color combinations that I want you guys to be aware of as you plan for color. And I do think it's very important that you have a plan when you start color, that we're not just sort of randomly picking colors off the color wheel, kind of throwing them down. I want you to be deliberate about how you choose color. Okay, so we're all familiar with the color wheel here. This is just sort of the top level of it, right? Where we've got our primaries, yellow, blue, and red, and we understand what the complement of each of those are. So orange is the complement of blue, green is the complement of red, and vice versa, and so on and so forth. And obviously, anywhere across the color wheel is another complement. So, for example, right here, this kind of blue purple is the complement to the yellow orange, and the sort of wine red is the complement to the yellow green, right? Okay, so let's get past that and let's kind of dig a little bit deeper. The first color scheme we're going to talk about is the simplest one, and it's the idea of a monochromatic color scheme where you are using just one color and tints and shades of that color. So you are allowed to add white or black to it, obviously, to make a painting based on this one color. And this, just randomly, I picked red here, but this would work for anywhere else on the color wheel. You can have a monochromatic yellow, you can have a monochromatic green painting. And that ends up looking something like this. So here's a monochromatic red and a monochromatic blue painting. And as you can see here with this one on the left, oops. I'm going to be drawing all over my thing after a while. There we go. Clear. As you can see here with this one on the left, this is using red as the base tone, and then it's tinting and shading the red. It's going down here, going up here to add other tones in, but overall, it's using that red tone. This is even more so. This blue looks like it was kind of using a base somewhere in here, and then it tinted this way and shaded this way. But monochromatic colors really set a mood. They are, you're definitely showing a time of day or you're showing a feeling, and it has the ability to really focus the viewer on whatever subject you're trying to look at. That is the upside of monochromatic. Obviously, though, you're pretty limited, right? Like, there are some things you can't do with a monochromatic palette. So let's move up a little bit to what would be another color scheme. And that is the idea of an analogous color scheme. Okay, so analogous, you guys can see, analogous colors are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Okay, so here I started with red, and then I went 2 down, and I went 1 up. Okay, so I've got, red as my base color, and then I went down into the kind of plum purple here, and then to the deep purple here, and then I've got, kind of this bright red right here. And the thing about analogous colors, when they're used together, these are actually the most harmonious color schemes. So analogous colors used together really looks very, compact and concise in your color plan. But of course, if you're going to stick with this, you're also cutting yourself out of using something across the color wheel. It's harder, to go over here and go, oh, I'm going to just skip over these blues. I'm going to pull this blue-green out right here. Now, that's not to say that you can't do that, but I do think that when you are picking a color plan, when you're thinking about a color plan, you kind of map out what your colors are first, what you want to use, and then when you start into your painting, you say, man, I really wish I had that blue-green, and then that palette is kind of telling you what you need to have at that point. That's one of the ways that you can make a deliberate choice with color. But let's look at a couple of examples of an analogous palette. So we've got these right here. This analogous palette only used, you know, these few, oops, forget that. Only used, you know, right here, these few colors, just 3. So this illustration almost appears like a monochromatic image because there's just 3 colors used there together. Of course, they're going, once again, up into the tints and the shades down here with those colors. But you can see, especially in this green right here, they are pulling this as a tint of that green. And this is also a tint of that green. So this is a very limited analogous palette. Then let's go over here and look at the Lion King image that you guys worked with before. And you can see that this is also an analogous palette, right? They're using all out of the red and orange right here. This is a tint, this is a shade of one of these colors, probably that dark red. But, you know, again, this is pretty limited. You wouldn't necessarily confuse this as a monochromatic palette, but you can see how just a very limited palette in an analogous color scheme still has the ability to bring out a mood, right? Like we all identify this with as either a morning or a sunset. We, having seen the movie, all identify it as morning, but if you had never seen this image before, you would definitely be able to say this is a particular time of day. And then let's look at this one from Up. So this is actually an analogous color scheme, but it's a pretty wide color scheme. They kind of went all the way around one side of the color wheel. They went from blue, you know, all the way around through red, stopping just before they got to yellow, right? So we're not getting in a whole lot of those, you know, kind of bright yellows, and we're not getting in any of the deep greens, but we've got everything else. Now, the thing is, even about this analogous color scheme, even though it's using, right, a lot of colors, so it kind of feels like, oh, well, they just picked every color from the palette, maybe, except you can see that while they are picking in some of these blues, there are a few, you know, right here, there's some of these blues right here that go right there. Most of the colors in this illustration are from up here. So while they did use a lot of colors, they leaned really heavily into those warm, bright hues, you know, that are at the top of the analogous palette. Let's go back and look at it again. You know, they really leaned really heavily into all of these hues right here, you know. They did not really, it's not like that image is really split. It's not like it's giving even attention to, let me clear that out. It's not like it's evenly split between yellows and blues. There's just a couple of blues there to pop out, you know, a little bit of accent, but most of it is a warm illustration. Okay, so that is analogous. Let's talk about complementary. Right, we just talked about that a little bit. Obviously, y'all know green and red, so on and so forth. And of course, if I'm going to sit here and do this, here's my complementary level. Right, I can sit here and I can do this, and I can spin this however I want and pick out any complementary color, right? Any of these are complements of each other. And what a complementary palette does, it can be a bit jarring. I do say that when you're working with complementary colors, you really want to pay attention that you are not evenly balancing the colors. In other words, you are not giving even time on the page, on the picture plane, to both sides of the complement, right? So here's, for example, you know, in this illustration, this blue-green there's a lot more blue-green used than the red. You know, we've got all this here. We've got all this right here. You know, you can even tell if this little color wheel diagram weren't there, you'd have even more behind that. There's probably some coming down here on the left side, you know, right here. And then there's a little bit of time, a little bit of space given to the oranges and the reds, specifically right here on her face. But the majority of this picture is one complement over the other, one color over the other. And then let's go over here and look at this image. I actually just got done rewatching Loki with my daughter, and I was really blown away at how the directors used color all through that show. And this whole scene of where Loki and Sylvie are on Lamentis is a great example of this. For the most part, that scene is actually shot monochromatic. It's actually shot all with a purple filter, purple blue filter. But then when the planet, gets to the really bad part of exploding, this is the moment right before Mobius shows up, whisks them back away to the TVA. We see the planet explode. We move into a complementary palette. But even though we're bringing in these, kind of warm complements to purple right here, the yellow, most of this picture is in those deep purples. Most of it is right here and right here, right? Like it's all in those really kind of deep wine purples that would be across the color wheel from the yellow. Okay, so moving right along, let's talk about split complementary. Okay, split complementary is when you have a complement, okay? So in this case, I've got blue and orange. And then you go across the color wheel and you pick the two colors on either side of one of the complements, okay? So that would mean, in this case, let's get my little spinner. Had to make sure I was on the right layer there, guys. If I sat here and spun this and went down here to this red, then my complement is that collection of greens. If I went down here to this purple, then my complement and my split complement is the yellow, and then the green and the orange on either side of the yellow. To this deep blue, my split complement is going to be the orange, and then it's also going to be the bright yellow and deeper orange on either side. You can see how, ever which way I turn this, I'm going to be picking up a new selection of colors. Now, a split complement can either take these three colors on this side, or it can just take one or the other. So in other words, a split complement could also be, say, this red right here, but I'm not going to do this green. I'm not going to do that. Take that out. Okay, I'm going to do this green and this blue, right? That now I am splitting the complement between those two, right? I'm going here, and then I'm going to this one, and I'm going to this one. I'm leaving out the direct complement of that deep red. You can work a split complement that way. That kind of gets kind of close to what's called a triadic color scheme, which we're going to talk about next. But it is something that you can do. However, I personally think that if you're going to do the split complement, you might as well pick up a little bit of the direct complement, just because it's there anyway. It's there in your other two split complements. Now, I personally like to use a split complement color scheme a lot myself. Here's an example of one right here. This is not me. But I feel like it kind of limits your palette, and I'm a huge believer in a limited color palette, but it also kind of gives you a lot to work with at the same time. So you're limiting your palette, but you're allowing these extra colors to come in and really focus on a mood. This illustration right here is one of mine. And the other thing is, while I talked about with analogous and complementary, how you want to let one of those colors be the primary color on the page. If you're working with complement, like the Loki scene, most of the page was purple with a little bit of yellow creeping in. In the up scene, most of that image was in the bright yellows and reds. Very little of it was down in the blues. I feel like with a split complement, you actually don't have to worry as much about making sure one of those colors is more dominant than not. And the reason for that is because you're kind of doing that automatically with the split complement. So in other words, in this illustration that I've got of my two characters, my horse and cat character, as you can see, these guys are kind of evenly split, right? Like there's an even amount of blue and orange red on this illustration, but you pick up on the orange red more because there is more variety in the orange red, right? You know, in this family right here, there's just more of those colors being used. So it doesn't have to balance it out as much. You know, I don't have to worry as much about making sure one of my colors is not more dominant. That's not to say I don't have to worry about it at all. But I do think that it gives you that flexibility to be like, okay, I'm going to put more color around the page. I don't want to worry about taking over my blues. You're automatically not going to do that because you are working with more on one side of the wheel than not. Okay, now I said this was actually very similar to what's called a triadic color scheme. And a triadic color scheme is where you are working with a triangle on the color wheel, okay? So this triangle, I'm going to get my spinner again. This triangle can point at any color, and you can also use the other colors at the equilateral triangle points from it, okay? So this is actually our primary colors right here, yellow, blue, and red. But we could go over here and we could get this sort of lime green and dark blue and orange and so on and so forth wherever I point the spinner to. In this case, what I've got is this kind of blue-green down here. I've got a bright orange, and then I've got that kind of plum red right there. And the thing about a triadic color pattern is it really lets you get a lot of life into your illustration. To be honest with you, triadic is the other color pattern, the other color scheme that I use a lot, because to me, it really gives a lot of movement to your illustration. So even if you have kind of a static composition and you're using that triadic color scheme, you're really able to get a lot of life in there without trying really hard with color. Here's an example of one of mine. My baby bird trying to fly. In this color scheme, I've kind of pulled out the blue, red, and yellow again, same as this one. But you can see this is actually a pretty simple illustration, right? There's no background. It really is just the characters. But part of the movement comes from the fact that the colors are so disparate around the picture plane. And there's also an old saying that says you can never go wrong with a red, blue, yellow color palette. And you can never go wrong with a red, green, yellow color palette. So, you know, that's just something to keep in mind with when you're working with triadic colors. I actually think this is probably the most versatile color palette you can use. And along with split complementary, it's one of the easiest ones to use. And then finally, we have tetradic. So let's look at that real quick. Tetradic, as you might have guessed, since we just talked about triadic, tetradic is where you're pulling off of a square from your color wheel. So you've got, now let's get my little spinner again. Whoops. Right here. There we go. You know, and as I move the spinner around and around, it's pointing at four corners of the color wheel. Okay, so now here's the thing about a tetradic color palette is you're never, those angles, that square is always at a 90-degree angle, okay? So I'm never going to pull a tetradic color palette by doing this. I'm never going to make my square this way. I'm never going to go, okay, I'm going to go green and then go down here to purple, right? Okay, so far so good. And get another 90-degree angle. I'm going to go up here this way, you know, but I'm never going to do this. I'm never going to go, oh, let's go back over here to this green. You guys can see how that is not at a 90-degree angle right here, right? So this is technically not a tetradic color scheme. Tetradic is only when you are going at a rectangle square with 90-degree angles from each other across the color wheel. Now, the thing about that a tetradic palette is good for, and again, this may feel a lot like, oh, you're just picking every palette on the wheel, but kind of like how analogous worked, the thing about tetradic is you're wanting to stay more in one family than the other. So it's really good for when you've got an ensemble cast. Okay, so let's look at these guys from Inside Out right here. Let's look at the characters. Now, y'all are all pretty familiar with the characters, and how they are all designed, each of them has their own color that kind of defined their personality, right? So blue, sad was blue, envy was green, angry was red, the colors that we generally associate with those emotions. But of course, these characters had to appear in scenes, over and over again in the movie, and they didn't want it to look super jumbled. So in this tetratic palette, that these characters are using, they were careful to lean heavily into this yellow-green and yellow side of the palette. And when you think about it, you can kind of see that. Obviously, envy has got, let me get at this. Envy, is green, but a lot more yellow-green. And joy, is yellow, and angry has got yellow, and so 3 out of these 5 characters are really leaning heavily into this side of that tetratic color scheme. Same thing down here. This is a scene from the movie Mamma Mia where it's actually a disco scene. If you guys have seen that movie, it's, really just kind of a happy, joyful, crazy, triumphant point in the movie. But it could very easily just descend into chaos, right? Because there were so many colors used, and that was kind of the point. But they used a tetratic color scheme to organize how the colors appear. Right here, blue, going to purple, going to green, going to yellow, just like that. And then each of these characters kind of stay under that in this scene, kind of stay under each one of those dominant palettes. But the overall dominant is actually the blue that's used here and the blue-green that's used on this side. Obviously the 2 backup singers, I can't actually remember either one of those characters' names right now. They just flew out of my head. But, they're both dressed in blue, right? Her outfit is more dark, more neutral than anything else. But between the background and what the characters are wearing, we're seeing a lot more blue here, here than we are anything else. So that's one thing to think about with a tetratic palette. It is a lot of colors to kind of work with, and there are, a little bit of rules since you're sticking to that 90-degree split between each of the colors. But if you had an illustration that had a lot of characters that you needed to organize, and you wanted to use color to organize them in your picture plane, using that tetratic palette but leaning into one dominant side of the color wheel is a good way to do it.